When you settle in to watch practically any war film set during the Second World War, you're bound to witness dramatic sequences where tanks clash against one another in thunderous exchanges of armor-piercing rounds. The camera shakes, the soundtrack swells, and steel behemoths duke it out in what appears to be the definitive manner by which armoured vehicles met their end during that global conflagration. But here's something that might surprise you. These cinematic representations, while visually spectacular, paint a wildly misleading picture of how German armoured fighting vehicles actually met their demise during the war. The reality is far removed from these Hollywood interpretations, and understanding what truly destroyed the Wehrmacht's tank forces requires us to look beyond the explosive spectacle of direct combat. If you were to examine the historical records carefully, you'd discover that genuine tank-versus-tank engagements accounted for less than 30% of all German armoured vehicle losses throughout the entire conflict. This figure alone should give us pause, because it means that the overwhelming majority of Panzers were eliminated by factors and forces that rarely receive attention in popular culture. The actual mechanisms of destruction were often mundane, unglamorous, and far more insidious than a dramatic duel on an open battlefield. The first reality we need to confront is perhaps the most sobering. A substantial portion of German tanks never fired their final shots in anger. Instead, they were simply left behind by their crews, deliberately demolished by the very men who had operated them, or immobilized along roadways with no feasible means of recovery. These weren't casualties of enemy action in the conventional sense. They were victims of something far more pervasive and ultimately more devastating than any weapon system the Allies deployed. That silent killer was logistics, and its impact cannot be overstated. By the time 1944 rolled around, the German war machine was already showing severe signs of strain. A maintenance officer who fell into Allied hands during this period provided his captors with information that was both revealing and damning. What he told them wasn't conjecture or pessimistic speculation. It was based on hard data that German maintenance units had been tracking throughout the war. According to the records he had access to, for every single panzer lost to enemy gunfire of any kind, 3 more were lost to mechanical failures or the simple absence of fuel. Let that sink in for a moment. The ratio wasn't close, it wasn't even competitive. German tanks were 3 times more likely to be put out of action by their own mechanical unreliability or supply shortages than by anything the enemy could throw at them. This wasn't some secret the Germans discovered late in the war either. Their own technical manuals and projected maintenance schedules had predicted exactly this kind of attrition rate. The workshops where these vehicles were supposed to be maintained and repaired had been living with these brutal realities on a daily basis from relatively early in the conflict. The problem was that knowledge didn't translate into solutions, especially as the war dragged on and Germany's industrial capacity came under increasingly heavy strain. Consider the infamous final drive unit on the Tiger tank. This component was responsible for transferring power from the transmission to the tracks, and it was spectacularly unreliable. Under operational conditions, it was known to destroy itself after covering merely 500 meters. 500 meters. That's barely more than 5 football fields. Now, imagine being a Tiger commander knowing that this critical component could fail at almost any moment, and that replacement parts were increasingly difficult to obtain. Even if your tank survived combat, even if enemy shells bounced harmlessly off your thick armor, that final drive was ticking like a time bomb, ready to transform your fearsome vehicle into an immobile pillbox. The parts shortage wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a fundamental crisis that got progressively worse as the war continued. While Tiger crews at the front were desperately trying to keep their vehicles operational and fighting enemy forces, the factories back in the Reich that produced these spare parts were themselves under assault. By 1944 and into 1945, strategic bombing campaigns were pummeling German industrial centres with devastating regularity. Raids involving 1,000 or more Allied bombers weren't unusual. They were becoming routine. Under these conditions, maintaining production of anything became a Herculean task, and complex precision components were especially vulnerable to disruption. The Panther tank provides another illuminating case study in how logistics failures could cripple even the most capable weapons systems. The Panther was, by most technical measures, an excellent tank. Its combination of firepower, armor protection, and mobility made it a formidable opponent on paper. But that sleek, deadly machine had an Achilles heel that had nothing to do with its combat capabilities. Each Panther required approximately 200 separate ball bearings for its various systems to function properly. 200. These weren't crude chunks of metal that could be hammered out in any workshop. They were precision-manufactured components that required specialized facilities to produce. One of the primary sources for these bearings was a complex of factories located in Schweinfurt, a German city that became intimately familiar with Allied bombing doctrine. When American bomber formations hammered these bearing plants repeatedly, the ripple effects traveled all the way to the front lines. Panthers that should have been rolling into battle were instead sitting in depots or assembly areas, mechanically complete in every way except for these small but absolutely critical components. The most advanced tank in your arsenal doesn't matter if it can't move because a bearing the size of a marble isn't available. There's a letter that survives from this period, written by a German mechanic to his family back home. In it, he captures the profound frustration that must have been endemic among maintenance personnel. His words were something along these lines. They had beautiful machines that could destroy absolutely anything they encountered. Yet these same machines sat completely useless, waiting for tiny gaskets that cost mere pennies. The juxtaposition he was describing speaks volumes about the nature of modern mechanized warfare. You could have the best technology, the most powerful gun, the thickest armor, but if you couldn't get a rubber seal or a small metal component, all of that engineering excellence became irrelevant. The Panzers weren't just fighting against American Shermans and Soviet T-34s. They were fighting a war of attrition that started long before they ever reached the battlefield. It began at the factories where raw materials were refined, continued through the assembly lines where those materials became components, travelled along transportation networks that were themselves under constant attack, and culminated in maintenance depots that increasingly resembled graveyards of partially cannibalized vehicles being picked apart for the few working pieces that could keep other tanks running for another day or week. Now, when we move beyond logistics and examine actual battlefield losses, the second most significant killer of German armour might surprise people almost as much as the first. It wasn't anti-tank guns, though those certainly took their toll. It wasn't enemy tanks, though they played their role. The second greatest destroyer of German armoured vehicles was something far simpler, far cheaper, and far more abundant: mines. Think about the economics involved here. A mine was an incredibly basic piece of military equipment. It could be manufactured quickly, cheaply, and in enormous quantities. It required no complex training to employ effectively. You buried it in the ground or concealed it along likely avenues of advance, and then you waited. The mine didn't need to be fed, didn't require ammunition resupply, and never got tired or demoralized. It just sat there, patiently, until several tons of German armor rolled over it. The Soviet Union, in particular, embraced mine warfare with almost industrial enthusiasm. Over the course of the entire war, the Red Army is estimated to have deployed somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 million mines. 200 million. That number is almost incomprehensible. To put it in perspective, that's enough mines to encircle the Earth's equator several times over if you placed them end to end. The Soviets weren't subtle about their mining doctrine. They simply saturated vast areas with these devices, turning entire regions into nightmares for any mechanized forces trying to advance. From an economic standpoint, mines represented asymmetric warfare in its purest form. A basic anti-tank mine might cost the equivalent of $3 to manufacture. It was a stamped piece of metal, some explosive filler, and a simple triggering mechanism. Meanwhile, a single King Tiger heavy tank cost the German Reich approximately 300,000 Reichsmarks. The math was brutally simple and devastatingly effective. For the cost of a single King Tiger, you could produce literally tens of thousands of mines. The Soviet TM-41 mine, which was one of their standard anti-tank designs, didn't even need to completely destroy a tank to achieve its purpose. It just needed to sever a track. That's all. In the infamous Russian mud season, when unpaved roads turned into rivers of sucking muck and off-road mobility became a fantasy, a tank with a broken track wasn't just damaged, it was effectively dead. A 60-ton vehicle sitting immobile in knee-deep mud might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did its crew or their commanders. It couldn't fight, couldn't withdraw, couldn't maneuver. The crew's options were limited to abandoning it, trying desperately to repair it under fire, or waiting for recovery vehicles that might never arrive. The American experience in Normandy following the D-Day landings confirmed what the Soviets had already learned on the Eastern Front. When American forces conducted detailed studies of German vehicle losses in the Bocage country and beyond, they discovered that mines and various improvised explosive devices were responsible for more destroyed or disabled German armour than bazookas and tank guns combined. This wasn't a marginal difference. Mines were significantly more effective than direct-fire anti-tank weapons. There's a quote from a German commander during this period that encapsulates the psychological impact of mine warfare. He said something to the effect that his forces were constantly scanning the horizon for enemy tanks and anti-tank positions, watching for visible threats, while the real danger was lying beneath their tracks, invisible and waiting. You couldn't spot a mine from your commander's cupola. You couldn't outmaneuver it. You couldn't return fire against it. The battlefield appeared deadly enough with all the visible threats, but the ground itself had become even more lethal than what moved across its surface. So we've established that logistics failures and mines were the first and second greatest killers of German armour. What, then, was the most effective destroyer of Panzers in actual direct combat? Most people would probably guess enemy tanks, given how these engagements are portrayed in film and literature. Others might suggest dedicated anti-tank guns, which certainly earned fearsome reputations during the war. But the correct answer is neither of these. The most lethal direct-fire killer of German tanks was artillery. Artillery had been called the king of battle since the First World War, and nothing about the Second World War diminished its crown. The Soviets, in particular, developed artillery tactics that were devastatingly effective against armoured formations. They perfected what they called the pack front tactic, which involved massing artillery pieces by the hundreds in concentrated areas. When German armour was detected in a particular sector, Soviet commanders would designate entire grid squares for obliteration. They would simply erase those portions of the map with overwhelming volumes of high-explosive shells. The beautiful thing about this approach, from the Soviet perspective, was that it didn't require pinpoint accuracy. A heavy 152mm howitzer shell didn't need to score a direct hit on a tank to destroy or disable it. If it landed within 10 meters, the concussive force alone could be sufficient to flip a Panzer like a child's toy. The shockwave could stun or kill crew members through the armour without even penetrating it. At the Battle of Kursk, which represented Germany's last major offensive operation on the Eastern Front, Soviet artillery batteries destroyed more German tanks in 3 hours of intensive bombardment than tank versus tank combat managed to knock out over 3 entire days of fighting. On the Western Front, American artillery proved to be even more terrifying in some respects, thanks to a technological innovation that gave it a significant edge. The proximity fuse, also called the VT-Fuzed, was one of those quiet technological breakthroughs that fundamentally changed combat without generating many headlines. These sophisticated fuses were designed to detonate artillery shells in mid-air shortly before they would have struck the ground. The result was that vehicles below were showered with shrapnel from above, from the sky rather than from ground level. This was catastrophically effective against tanks because armour protection is not uniform across a vehicle's surfaces. Tank designers concentrated the thickest armour on the front and sides, where enemy fire was most likely to come from. The top of a tank, however, was only lightly protected. On many German tanks, the top armour was a mere 25 millimeters thick. This was adequate protection against shell fragments falling from distant explosions, but it was completely inadequate against concentrated shrapnel from a proximity-fused shell detonating directly overhead. After an American artillery barrage employing these fuses, recovery crews and medics would find tank commanders who had been decapitated while standing in their turrets. They were struck down before they could even process that they were under attack, killed by shrapnel coming from above while they searched for threats on the ground level. One Panzer veteran who survived the war admitted in his memoirs that American artillery inspired more fear in him than any other aspect of combat. You couldn't duel with artillery. You couldn't see the gun that was firing at you. You couldn't take evasive action or return fire effectively. You simply had to endure it and hope that statistics worked in your favour. For many, they didn't. Now, while we're discussing direct combat systems that destroyed German tanks, there's one weapon that deserves special mention precisely because it seems so improbable. The humble Soviet VT-41 anti-tank rifle. Yes, you read that correctly. A rifle. In an era of multi-ton tanks with thick armour, the Soviets found a way to make a man-portable rifle into an effective tank killer, though not in the way you might expect. The PTRD-41 was a 14.5mm anti-tank rifle, essentially an enormous bolt-action weapon that fired what amounted to a very large bullet. By the mid-war period, this rifle could not penetrate the frontal armour of heavy German tanks like the Tiger. It simply didn't have the kinetic energy to punch through that much steel. But here's the thing, it didn't need to. Soviet infantry discovered through experience that if you concentrated fire on a tank's vision devices, periscopes and vision slits, you could effectively blind it. Imagine being inside a tank that suddenly had 20 or 30 of these heavy rounds hammer into its vision ports and periscopes. The optics are shattered, the vision blocks are cracked or displaced, and suddenly you can't see out of your vehicle anymore. A blinded tank commander couldn't navigate properly. Tanks would stumble into ditches, scrape along buildings, collide with obstacles, or simply button up completely with every hatch sealed. A tank with every hatch closed and no functioning vision devices became a deaf, sightless box on tracks. It might still have a functioning gun and engine, but it was useless on a fluid battlefield where situational awareness meant the difference between life and death. The Soviets manufactured approximately 471,000 of these anti-tank rifles during the war. Each one cost about 193 rubles to produce. Compare that to the 300,000 Reichsmarks required to build a single Tiger tank. This was asymmetric warfare rendered in steel and arithmetic. You could blind dozens or even hundreds of tanks for the cost of building a single replacement tank. The economic efficiency was staggering. Then we have to consider air power, which represented yet another dimension of the aerial assault on German armour. The Allies, particularly the British and Americans, developed sophisticated air-ground cooperation systems that kept armoured formations under constant threat from above. The British cab rank system was particularly ingenious. It kept rocket-armed fighter aircraft circling in designated patrol areas, ready to be called down on any target that ground forces radioed back to headquarters. The Hawker Typhoon, armed with rockets, became one of the most feared aircraft among German tank crews, even though the actual statistics don't quite support the reputation. The truth is that these rocket-armed aircraft were notoriously inaccurate. Direct hit rates with rockets against tanks hovered somewhere below 5%. Out of every 20 rockets fired, only one might actually strike a tank directly. But here's what historians and military analysts eventually realized. Direct hits weren't the point. The psychological impact was what mattered. When Typhoons or similar aircraft appeared overhead and began their diving attacks, Panzer units would freeze. They would seek cover under trees, bunch up in wooded areas, and essentially stop moving during daylight hours. Movement would only resume under cover of darkness. This self-imposed immobility was exactly what Allied artillery observers and ground forces wanted. Once German armour was clustered and stationary, hiding under tree cover, they became perfect targets for artillery strikes. An officer with a map reference and a radio connection to artillery batteries could direct devastating fire onto these concentrated positions. The aircraft didn't need to destroy tanks with direct hits to kill them. They just needed to pressure German forces into behaving in ways that made them vulnerable to other weapons systems. Pressure on a battlefield is often more lethal than precision. We need to talk about the mathematics of industrial warfare, because ultimately that's what determined the outcome of the armoured war in Europe. Germany manufactured approximately 49,000 armoured vehicles of various types during the entire war. This included everything from light tanks to the heaviest Tigers and King Tigers, tank destroyers, assault guns, and every variation in between. 49,000 sounds like a substantial number until you compare it to what they were facing. The combined production of Germany's enemies, primarily the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain, totaled around 227,000 tanks and armoured fighting vehicles. Germany was outnumbered by a factor of more than 4-1 in terms of total production. But even this ratio doesn't tell the full story, because German tanks weren't trading at anything close to 1-1 with their opponents. The mythology of German armour superiority suggests that a Tiger or Panther could routinely destroy multiple enemy tanks before being knocked out itself, and while individual engagements sometimes bore this out, the aggregate picture was very different. German tanks were being bled out by weapons and factors that cost a fraction of what they did. A mine cheaper than a steel helmet could mission kill a tank worth more than a house. Artillery shells lobbed from positions far beyond visual range could destroy vehicles without the gun crews ever seeing what they hit. And as we've discussed extensively, mechanical breakdowns and fuel shortages were eliminating vehicles at a rate that dwarfed combat losses. The attrition Germany was experiencing didn't only happen under fire at the front lines. It started back in the industrial heartland, at the smelters and factories where raw materials were turned into components. It rippled through transportation networks that were increasingly disrupted by bombing raids and partisan attacks. It manifested in maintenance depots that lacked proper tools and parts. And it ended in muddy fields across Europe with entries in logbooks that simply noted insufficient fuel or awaiting parts that would never arrive. Perhaps the darkest chapter in the story of German armoured losses comes at the very end of the war. By 1945, as Germany's position became increasingly hopeless and Allied forces closed in from all directions, more German tanks were destroyed by their own crews than by enemy action. When Panzer units found themselves out of fuel, out of ammunition, and out of options, standard procedure was to destroy the vehicles rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands intact. Crews would place demolition charges in their tanks and blow them apart from the inside. Wehrmacht maintenance reports from April 1945 read like a funeral register. Entry after entry notes destroyed by crew order, demolished due to fuel shortage, self-demolition executed, abandoned in place due to mechanical failure. The enemy forces didn't even need to be present to claim these vehicles. The collapse of Germany's supply infrastructure, the disintegration of its transportation network, and the simple passage of time were doing the work for the Allies. Tanks that had survived months or years of combat were being rendered useless, not by enemy guns, but by the systemic failure of everything that kept them operational. So when we step back and look at the complete picture of what actually killed German tanks during World War II, we have to discard the dramatic narratives that cinema has fed us. The reality wasn't about ace tank commanders dueling at dawn or desperate last stands against overwhelming odds. The reality was far more mundane and far more brutal. It was about supply trucks that never made it to the front because the roads were cratered by bombs or fuel was diverted elsewhere. It was about critical bearings that were never manufactured because the factory that made them was destroyed in an air raid last week. It was about rain that transformed roads into impassable quagmires where even the most powerful engine couldn't generate enough traction to move. It was about mines planted for pennies per unit, scattered by the millions across every likely avenue of advance. It was about batteries of howitzers positioned miles away from the front, firing shells guided by sophisticated fuses and supported by seemingly bottomless supplies of ammunition. This is the brutal lesson of mid-century mechanized warfare that applies far beyond just the German experience in World War II. Engineering brilliance and tactical excellence can be utterly overwhelmed by shortages, geography, and sheer mass. Germany designed and built magnificent machines that could dominate any individual engagement they found themselves in. Tank for tank, on a neutral testing ground with adequate supplies, a Tiger or Panther could defeat most Allied tanks in a fair fight. But modern warfare isn't a medieval joust. It's not about individual champions meeting on a field of honor. Modern mechanized warfare is about production lines that operate continuously, running day and night shifts to churn out vehicles, weapons, and ammunition. It's about rail schedules that deliver supplies where they're needed, when they're needed. It's about repair depots stacked to the ceiling with spare parts for every system that might fail. It's about air superiority that allows you to bomb your enemy's factories while protecting your own. It's about having enough fuel to not just reach the battlefield, but to maneuver once you're there and then withdraw when necessary. It's about all the unglamorous logistical considerations that don't make for exciting cinema but determine who wins and who loses. The Allies understood this reality and transformed their understanding into the most efficient tank-killing system that had ever been created up to that point in history. They didn't just build more tanks than Germany, though they did that. They didn't just build better tanks than Germany, though in some cases they did that too. What they really did was build a comprehensive system that attacked German armour at every point of vulnerability. They bombed the factories that made the tanks. They bombed the factories that made the components for the tanks. They bombed the rail networks that delivered those components. They bombed the fuel refineries and storage depots. They cratered the roads. They mined the fields. They coordinated their air power with their ground forces. They massed artillery in unprecedented concentrations. They maintained supply lines that stretched across oceans and continents. In the final analysis, the greatest slayer of German armour during World War II wasn't a rival tank ace waiting in ambush behind a hedgerow. It wasn't a skilled anti-tank gun crew dug in at a crossroads. It wasn't even the overwhelming numbers of enemy vehicles they faced, though that certainly played its role. The true killer was something more abstract but infinitely more powerful. It was logistics, industrial capacity, and the relentless arithmetic of attrition. It was the reality that you can have the most advanced technology in the world, but if you can't fuel it, can't repair it, can't supply it with ammunition, and can't protect the infrastructure that supports it, then all that technological sophistication becomes meaningless. The Panzer arm of the Wehrmacht entered the war as one of the most formidable fighting forces ever assembled, and its early victories seemed to justify all the doctrine and technology that had gone into creating it. But over time, as the war expanded and Germany found itself fighting on multiple fronts against enemies with vastly greater industrial capacity, those magnificent machines were ground down not primarily by enemy action, but by the inexorable logic of modern industrial warfare. Every tank that broke down and couldn't be repaired, every vehicle that ran out of fuel and had to be abandoned, every panzer that struck a mine or was caught in an artillery barrage represented not just the loss of equipment, but the erosion of Germany's ability to wage mobile warfare. The story of German tank losses in World War II is ultimately a story about the limits of tactical excellence when confronted with strategic insufficiency. No amount of superior engineering, brave crews, or skillful commanders could compensate for fundamental disadvantages in production capacity, resource availability, and logistical sustainability. The tank battles that captivate our imagination and fill our movie screens were real, and they were important, but they were sideshows compared to the grinding reality of mechanical attrition, supply failures, and the systematic destruction of Germany's industrial base. Understanding this reality helps us understand not just World War II, but the nature of modern warfare itself, where victory increasingly goes not to whoever has the best weapons, but to whoever can sustain operations longest and most effectively. The Germans learned this lesson the hard way, paid for it with roughly 49,000 destroyed armoured vehicles, and ultimately lost the war not on any particular battlefield, but in the factories, rail yards, and supply depots that couldn't keep pace with the demands being placed upon them.